Hello, welcome. Thank you for joining Hospice Simcoe, the End of Beginnings presentation series. This month's presentation is all about medical termination of pregnancy. So a very difficult topic, but an important one, as parents having to make this agonizing decision. They don't enter into it lightly. And it can often come with feelings of guilt and shame, as well as grief and deep loss. So it is my hope that we are able to open up the conversation and allow some space for parents and families that have had to make this decision to feel heard and supported and like they belong in the pregnancy and infant loss conversation, because they do. So my name is Emma. I'm a lactation consultant and mental health advocate here in Simcoe County. And it's truly my honor to be a part of Hospice Simcoe End of Beginnings program. I myself have had 3 pregnancy losses, 2 of which had complications that ended in having to make a decision around medical termination. And I struggled immensely after these losses, to the point where I was not functioning well in my day-to-day life. And it was through support of my family, my community, programs like End of Beginnings, some incredible therapists, that I'm at a place where I'm now able to walk with my grief. We never get through grief. We just learn how to walk with it. And it's really my hope to be able to walk with others in theirs, and know that no family should be alone in this. So first off, I want to acknowledge that this is a safe space for any and all people who have had to make the agonizing decision to medically terminate a pregnancy. It is, again, not an easy decision to make, and you belong here and you belong in this conversation. So a little sort of technical stuff. What are we talking about? Medical termination in our context is when we are speaking about ending a pregnancy or withdrawing life support from a newborn due to medical complications, reasons, prognosis that pose a threat to the health and well-being of either the pregnant person and or the baby. So that's the context in which we're speaking in this particular conversation. So this heartbreaking decision is a big one. And there are a few different ways in which it happens. We're not going into the details. That's not the place for this. But I do think it's important to have a little bit of understanding of some of the different sort of just surface level ways that it may happen. So it all depends on the gestation, as well as sort of parental choice and care provider comfort and location and all of that. There's many complexities to it. But an earlier gestation may be able to take medication, for example, to end the pregnancy. So, for example, an ectopic pregnancy, so that's a pregnancy that occurs outside of the uterus, is going to have a different type of medication than a pregnancy that is located in the uterus, because it's just different mechanisms of action in the body. But there are some medications that may be used. Some people may opt for surgery or procedure. So some of you may have heard of a D&C. That might be something that is possible or offered. And then around sort of 18 weeks and sometimes sooner, depending again on parental choice and comfort of care provider, location, etc., that an induction of labor may be offered as the way of ending the pregnancy itself. And then the other piece is also making the choice to withdraw life support for an infant that has already been born and is on life support, so needing help with specifically breathing, and is unable to survive without the support. So termination of pregnancy or withdrawing life support is an intense, possibly one of the most difficult choices any parent will have to face. And it makes the grief a little bit more complex, I would say. So any pregnancy or infant loss comes with huge amounts of isolation, guilt, and grief. But when we layer in the added condition of termination, it can muddy those waters even more and make that grief more complex. So some of the times that isolation, if it's early in a pregnancy and a parent hasn't chosen to share their pregnancy news with anybody, that in and of itself can lead to isolation. But then when you're making the choice to end the pregnancy, it can further those feelings of isolation. It can also, if it's been announced, the pregnancy, and it's later gestation, and making that choice, it can sometimes be hard to share the information that you've made the choice to end the pregnancy, because parents may feel scared to share this information for fear of judgment, shame, ridicule, blame. They may already be feeling those things in themselves, and they're scared that they will be feeling that from others, and so may choose to not share that information, and that just further leads to feelings of isolation and being alone in this heaviness. There's also often a lot of grief, guilt in the grief. There's a lot of grief too, getting to that. But that guilt in the grief, again, with many losses, parents can often sort of play the blame game, right? Of what did I do wrong? What could I have done differently? Even though that is nothing to do with what's happened. That can be where some people's brains go. And then when we add in, again, that layer of making the choice to end the pregnancy, it can increase those feelings of guilt. Because we can have that what if feeling in the back of our mind, which is never helpful, but it's there. And it's a heavy feeling to sit through, especially as we get to the next point, when you're also in the heaviness of grief. So feeling grief after having made this agonizing choice can be confusing, unsettling, or uncomfortable, as some parents will feel, again, where the guilt piece comes in, may feel like they're not entitled to feeling grief, which again is not true, but this is part of what many people can experience, a feeling like they're unworthy of grieving because they made the choice. Now, just as an aside, I'm going to tell my story in the next slide. But one of the OBs that I worked with in the special pregnancy program at Mount Sinai told me after our choice that it wasn't really a choice, that it was just making that decision sooner that my body would have done on its own in a few weeks anyways, which at the time didn't help me. But as I've moved farther away, it happened in 2017, I have come back to her saying that many times, and I'm finding it helpful. So this grief can just be harder to accept and to sit in for those who have made that choice. And one of the real problems that we can see with this is that for those who have made the choice to terminate and are uncomfortable in their grief and not allowing themselves to grieve because they're blaming themselves, the guilt is overriding the grief, it can actually lead to higher rates of depression, anxiety, and post-traumatic stress disorder. So it's a difficult thing to move through, but when parents are already dealing with these difficult emotions within themselves, being scared of judgment from others, as well as sort of just a general lack of support and understanding of parents' unique situation, can make the grieving process longer and harder. So I really want to emphasize for anybody who has gone through this, that you're not alone, and that making this choice of medical termination is an entirely heart-wrenching decision, and no parent should ever have to face it. Having made this decision doesn't mean that your baby wasn't loved or wanted, right? It means you made the best decision you could at the time with the information available to you. And it was coming from a place of compassion and love, right? There are many others out there who have had to make this heartbreaking choice. And I really believe that connecting with them and sharing your grief is part of that first step towards being able to walk with your own grief. So a little bit about my story. Well, the first is I had an ectopic pregnancy that ruptured, and I was bleeding, and I had to have emergency surgery, and the choice was to remove the growing embryo. And I also lost a fallopian tube in the process because it had burst and was damaged. So I had a lot of grief around that. And then the second, well, it was my third pregnancy loss, but second with complications, was around my son, Jonah. He was stillborn in 2017. So my story with that is I had had a complicated pregnancy to begin with. I had had lots of bleeding throughout the pregnancy that we couldn't figure out where it was coming from. We later discovered it was called placental abruption. So the placenta kept coming away from the wall of the uterus repeatedly. So there wasn't very good blood flow already very early on. So lots of bleeding. And then there were significant heart problems at the anatomy scan. And then at 21 weeks gestation, my water broke. And I was offered at that time by an incredibly compassionate obstetrician, an induction of labor to end the pregnancy at that point in time, knowing that the outcome was probably not going to be a positive one, given the history of the pregnancy already, it being so complicated with heart problems and what's the word I'm looking for? Bleeding problems. That's not what I'm meaning, but bear with me. It's a difficult story to tell, so I kind of get choked up. So we were offered an induction of labor. My partner and I chose not to induce labor and chose instead to do everything that we could to give our baby the best chance of survival. And so that was, our choice was respected, and I was put on immediate bed rest, full bed rest, admitted to hospital, given IV antibiotics, and I did all of the things. I read all of the survival stories. There were not many, but I clung on to the hopes of those. There were also stories of membranes resealing, which I knew in my mind was very unlikely, but again, I wanted it to be true. So I did all the things to help with that. And about 5 weeks into bed rest, I stopped leaking fluid, and I was really excited. I thought maybe this is it. My membrane sealed, went off to Mount Sinai in Toronto, and a few days after that, and it was sort of the opposite. So my membranes hadn't resealed. I had just stopped making fluid. And so, not to get into too many details, but so my uterus was essentially like collapsing in on my baby. My baby was not able to survive. And so at that point, my partner and I made the decision at that point to terminate the pregnancy and have an induction of labor. And our son was stillborn the following day. And I share this story because I haven't shared it for so long. I've been very afraid of the judgment and the ridicule, or the judgment, and I was afraid to share it, having made that choice. Like, in some way, my loss isn't as great as someone else's loss who didn't make that choice. I know that rationally not to be true, but emotionally is harder to grasp. And so when I was approached by Hospice Simcoe to share my story, I thought it was really important to do that for my own healing journey. And also, if I felt alone, and I really don't want people to feel alone, I need to be vulnerable and share my story. So somebody else might hear my story and not feel as isolated and alone, and know that their grief is still valid and their baby was still loved and wanted. It's just a really important aspect to my work that I do, really. And in supporting parental mental health, grief, and community building. So that's my story. And I think it's really important to not only reach out to others who have had losses, but reaching out within your own community also. So Hospice Simcoe has the Ended Beginnings program, the volunteer peer support, fantastic resource. You can find them on their website here, or call them directly with their phone number. There's also a number of other supports in each individual community. So I really encourage you to reach out to your own local chapter of hospice if you're not in Simcoe County. Bridget's Bunnies does incredible work for pregnancy and infant loss as well. The PALE network, reaching out to like Facebook groups, finding other peer support, hearing other people's stories, as well as counseling and therapy. Really, really important. I actually developed post-traumatic stress disorder for having not dealt with my grief and all of this. And I don't wish that on anybody. So really encouraging you to have those conversations. And the other is exactly that, is having conversations. And when we start to talk about these things, and which is why I'm so incredibly grateful for Hospice Simcoe and what they're doing, is these presentations open the door for other people to have these conversations. And that's when we start to discuss losses and difficult topics, is when we start to really connect as a community. And being vulnerable and supporting one another is really how we grow, right? And so reaching out, therapy, support groups, taking care of one another, really, really important, having these difficult conversations. It may also open the door for somebody. For example, I often have conversations around the work that I do with older generations who then will share that they lost a baby and they never told anybody, and they've never talked about it, and they still think about that baby, and thinking how long some people have carried their grief alone, and just how heartbreaking that is. And so my hope is to open up the space to have these conversations so people feel safe to share their stories and their grief. And so thank you for joining my portion of the presentation. I know we have a few other stories to share with you. And I encourage you to get involved with Hospice Simcoe and Beginnings if you have any interest at all. Volunteer, we're always looking for volunteers. And to thank you for your time and hearing my story. It's such an honor to be able to share my story in such a vulnerable and important way. So thank you.
Hi everyone, I'm Danielle and this is my husband Joey, and we've partnered with Hospice Simcoe to open up the conversation about something that is considered kind of a taboo subject in the world of pregnancy and infant loss, and that's medical termination. I think I want to get across that a loss is a loss. And I think that is something that even we didn't really feel in the beginning. We felt like, we don't really fit in with other lost parents because we had to make the decision. Although we didn't feel like the decision was ours to make because it was pretty inevitable in our case. It is something that weighs on you, and in the end, you lose a baby. So it is something important to note that just because we had a completely different situation, there's so many reasons why medical termination occurs, and it's important to talk about those reasons and to understand and to get it out to the general public that people who haven't experienced loss in general, let alone a medical termination, will understand a little bit more about reasons why this happens and the stories behind termination.
And this is just our experience and our perspective. But it doesn't matter what your story is. It doesn't matter the reason why you're doing it. This is your story and your reason. So you've got to understand that a loss is a loss, like Danielle said. And unfortunately, this kind of stuff has to happen. And every story is unique, and we're here to tell you our version of ours, and hopefully reach out to some parents that need to hear some of the things that we're about to talk about.
To tell you a little bit of background about our story, we lost our baby in 2017. We got a phone call from our doctor saying that the baby's head was measuring too small at the 12-week ultrasound, and we needed to go for further testing. So when we went down to the specialist to get further testing, in that moment we were really happy because we thought this is just going to be something in our past, and we're gonna get the good results and go home and feel happy about what we saw. But unfortunately, we got the news that our baby's skull wasn't forming. So basically, this is called exencephaly or anencephaly, and this is a rare neurological condition, and we knew nothing about it. But when we got the news, we knew by how the doctor said it that it was not something that this baby would survive. So we were given the choice to carry out the pregnancy and have the baby, but the doctor himself said that there was nothing that was going to prolong this baby's life.
He basically said that our baby wouldn't survive an hour outside of the womb, and if they did, it would only be for about a day. Unfortunately, after long discussion and nights of crying and stuff, we made the decision to have a medical termination. It's definitely the hardest decision we've ever made in our lives. And it's such a taboo issue, and it's something that really needs to be talked about because there's a multitude of different reasons why people go through medical termination. And it's something that no one wants to talk about who hasn't gone through it. And even if you have gone through it, it is hard to talk about with others because you're not sure what they would think.
Just saying at the beginning of this video, we lost a baby, it makes me feel guilty because I know that there's more to that story. And it's not just we lost the baby. We didn't have a miscarriage and we didn't have to say goodbye to this baby suddenly. It was like a decision that was placed on us. And it is a very guilty feeling. And it's something that people need to talk about because there are reasons why it happens and why parents make this decision. It's not because we didn't want the baby. We wanted this baby with all of our hearts. And like I said, we were in that ultrasound thinking everything's going to be great, and seeing the little baby moving, it was the best feeling ever. And then hearing that news was just, it was all just taken away and ripped away from us. We had to go through the grief of making that decision and placing that guilt on ourselves as well, even though we knew that it was inevitable.
From my side too, I didn't just worry about the baby. I worried about Danielle too. She was going through the pregnancy with health issues stemming from that pregnancy. For both the mom and baby, I had to think about both sides of that. It was definitely the hardest decision we've ever had to make. And for me personally, I basically lost the baby twice when we found out, and we had to make the decision. And then when the day came where we had the operation.
I think this is really important to get across because I think even I don't like this word abortion. It has a really negative connotation. When they think of the word abortion, they just think of the stigma surrounding it all. They don't think about the story that the parents are going through, the experiences, what led them to this decision if they are making that decision. Medical termination is one of the most emotional and grief-stricken things you can ever go through because you're not only, like Joey said, you're not only losing your baby, you're making the decision to say goodbye to your baby. There are many different situations and you have to kind of, like I said, look at the story behind it and look at the experiences and what's leading up to the medical termination. There's always a reason why it happens, and placing judgment on somebody for doing that is something that we need to talk about and openly discuss the reasoning why it occurs. So in our situation, unfortunately, I was on blood thinners that are not safe for pregnancy, and we knew this. But I think that's where a lot of the guilt comes in because at the beginning, we didn't know why this happened to us. And there was a lot of talk about it just being a fluke, and our next pregnancy, we'll have the same amount of chances at happening because this neurological defect only happens, what did they say, like 1 in every 2,000 pregnancies? 200,000 pregnancies. So this was a very, very rare thing to happen. We did all of these tests to figure out kind of why this might have happened. And when I saw my hematologist, 2 years later, she said that our case has been studied in Toronto and we're like famous over there. They think that my blood thinners were the reason why this neurological defect occurred. She was happy that they came to a conclusion that it was likely due to my blood thinners. But then all the feelings of the guilt and we could have done something to prevent this just made me come right back to where we started in that moment. And I just broke down. And to her, it just felt like I was just a number. And our case was just something that they were studying. Well, this is our life. I think she was trying to also reassure us that for our future pregnancies, that this is something that we don't have to worry about it. But in the moment, it was not reassuring. It was just flooding back those emotions that I can't believe that this happened. I think also it's really worth mentioning that when we first got told that we would make the decision to medically terminate, I always believed that when I got pregnant, no matter what, I would have that baby, no matter the circumstance. But when we were placed with that decision, the things that flooded back in my mind, and of course, unfortunately, I started looking up exencephaly on YouTube and trying to get to know what it was and the decisions that other people have made about it. I saw the YouTube videos that were basically saying that you're not God and you can't control what happens to your baby. God has a plan for you, and whatever happens while the baby's in the womb, when they come out into this world, that's the life that they have been chosen to live by God. Having those thoughts and having the fear of being judged and this taboo subject is just something that you never think that you're going to have to face. Telling them your experience, you feel like you have to back yourself up and to fully explain the entire story so that I don't feel judged by others, and also not to place judgment on myself. And that's a terrible thing, because this happens again for so many different reasons, but there is so much judgment placed upon this, and there's not enough understanding about why this happens. It's a lifelong process of accepting your decision, accepting that, you know, we lost this baby and we have to move on with our life.
It doesn't matter what your views are. When you're put in that situation, everything changes. There is that stigma about abortion, but when you're put into that scenario and the doctor, a medical expert, tells you that there's something wrong and there's the baby might not survive, or you might not survive, or what have you, then you have to make that decision, whatever's best for your family. And sometimes the inevitable happens where you have to make what you think at the time is the wrong decision or the right decision, and you have to live with that. And we're trying to help people be able to live with that, because it doesn't just go away. We're faced, I think about our baby every day. Danielle thinks about our baby every day. She went through the emotional and physical. As a dad, I went through the emotional and physical, because I feel like my heart broke when that happened.
When I was going in for the DNC, I remember just thinking, I really hope that these nurses know that I didn't make this decision and they're not judging me. And that's the silliest thing I could ever think, because I'm a nurse and I know that when you're doing a surgery, it's not like you're going in blind and you don't know what's going on. You know what's going on, you know this history, but I don't know why that stuck in my head so much. And then also the feeling after the fact that, I mean, even before you have the surgery, but after the surgery, when you're trying to cope and realize that this is real, just thinking, what if I got a second or third opinion? Like, did we make the right decision? Was this baby, we never saw the baby. All we had seen before was an ultrasound, which was exciting and made it feel real. But at the same time, we never physically got to hold our baby. We never got to see our baby. The only thing that made it super real after the surgery was that we got 2 little footprints on a little piece of paper that the doctor did for us that we requested, and that meant the absolute world to us. It made it feel a million times more real, and it made it terrible for us, but it also gave us a physical piece of that baby. Yeah. And I definitely recommend it to anybody going through that. Request that, because sometimes the hospital won't offer it to you, but speak up about it, because even though you don't think you want a piece of that baby now, you will. Joey and I both got tattoos of our baby's footprints. Joey got them as well on his ribs.
I'm not showing that though.
If you are going through a DNC or some kind of medical termination procedure, think about the future too in that situation, and try to get as much as you can. If you are physically having the baby, again, it's so hard to think about, you know, on those social media groups and stuff, you always see trigger warnings and pictures of babies who have passed and the parents holding their child. And before I lost a baby, I always thought I would never want to have a picture of my child that I lost, because it would just make me so sad to look at the baby when they're passed, and I wouldn't be able to handle it. But now, having gone through it and having those 2 little footprints, although it's not a photo and we never got that chance, having those footprints mean the world to us. And I definitely recommend thinking of that stuff for your future and coping, and having that token from your baby.
Those footprints, like I cherished that when the doctor came out of the room, and I haven't even seen Danielle yet. She gave me an envelope and there was 2 little footprints in there. I must have looked like so ridiculous in the hospital because I was on my hands and knees and I was bawling, just because I knew we weren't going to get to hold our child, and knowing that there was some physical evidence that we did go through this. We did have a child who had a heartbeat and
Little footprints.
Even though they were so young. It just meant the world.
I think too, like, remember when we first got them and we brought them home and we just like touched the footprints, and it made us feel connected to our baby, because we didn't have that physical feeling. We didn't get to hold our baby. We didn't get to kiss their little nose, like just to have something physical. That's all we had. So we were like touching the footprints, pretending we were touching their little toes. And like there's nothing you can do. You're not getting your baby back. And that's the hardest part about medical termination. I think for me, because Joey, went through all the emotions while I was in surgery. Well, I was under general anesthetic. So I had the emotion of sitting on the table and just like waiting for the inevitable to happen and crying and just not knowing how to, this is emotional, how to feel. Waking up and dealing with the physical part and not having that baby, and just kind of waking up and being like, oh, this actually happened. Like, you feel like a part of you's missing. Like, it's a weird feeling of feeling empty, but I never actually got to feel the baby kick, but I felt it. I don't know how to explain it, but it's very emotional and it's very surreal. And it's been how many years? 4 years.
Yeah.
And I still, like, we both still get so upset, and it is very traumatic. And I think that's something that we want to get across as well, is that when you go through any kind of medical termination procedure, you still are going through, like me, I was going through this physical trauma as well as this emotional trauma. So I'm, like, fresh out of surgery. You have to deal with like getting yourself together, and then emotionally, like, you're just not there. I remember going home. We went to my parents' house so they could take care of us. I just remember setting my camera up and just having this raw footage of me just crying and talking to myself on the camera, because I needed to have an outlet, and I didn't feel like I could physically write anything. Like, I just didn't feel like I could do anything for myself other than just cry and talk. So I just set up the camera, talked to myself, and just like let it all out. I haven't looked at the video since, because it is like 10 minutes long of me just crying, but I think that was very therapeutic for me, and something for me to get things off of my chest without feeling like I'm crying too much, because I just let myself cry. I think that's an important part of the grief with medical termination as well, is just letting yourself cry and feel vulnerable and have that feeling of guilt, because it's natural. You're going to feel guilty no matter what you decide, no matter the situation. Our situation was pretty inevitable that the baby was going to pass on, and even knowing that did not make that decision any easier, and it did still place that guilt on us. So let yourself just feel that feeling. And even though, when you talk to other people later on, they're going to, oh, don't feel guilty. It wasn't your fault. It wasn't anything that you would have decided, these are the feelings you're going to feel, and they're so natural. So just let yourself feel that.
So one of the things that's always on our mind ever since then was a lot of the unknowns that we had, like the sex of the baby. Would they look like Danielle? Would they look more like me? The things that we will never know about that child. And it's very hard. Unfortunately, it was a little bit too early. We couldn't tell the sex. But would we have wanted to? We had names picked out. We do have a child now. We have a little boy named Carter. What if that child was a boy? What if that child was supposed to be a Carter?
We were faced with the decision whether we wanted to wait a couple weeks with the pregnancy and find out if it was a girl or boy. Remember, they asked us if we did want to, because we went through genetics testing. We did all this testing while we were at the hospital, and the genetics counselor did end up saying, you know, did you want to carry out this pregnancy for another, because we were 15 weeks along by the time we have the appointment. Did you want to wait another couple weeks and find out the sex of the baby? And I think we both decided instantly, like, no, we don't want to know. I personally thought about, I haven't felt this baby kick yet. We know we're medically terminating. Do I want to physically put myself through that of feeling the baby kick, becoming more attached to this child, and having these special moments, and then knowing that we're going to say goodbye to this baby?
But that's just our personal view of it. Everybody has their own personal view.
Yeah.
So if that makes you cope, if that makes you ease your mind, then definitely find out the sex.
And I always think, like, we've talked about it several times, if we could go back, would we wait and see what the baby's sex was? Because it is hard. It is, like, we've always had the names Riley for a girl and Carter for a boy, and we always think, like, was that our Riley? Is it easier to know that it was your Riley, or leave it unknown? We'll never know, because we decided not to learn the sex. It connects you to the baby in the sense that when people bring your baby up, you can actually say their name and remember them in that way. We ended up going to group counseling for pregnancy and infant loss, and met several people who had stillbirths, and named them and have those moments with them. It made them cope a lot better, having people say their baby's name. And that's what they like to get across, whereas we didn't have that. So we decided kind of in the moment that we would call our baby Little Us, because we didn't know the sex and we didn't have those moments with them, but they're still our Little Us, and that's what we remember them by.
I think the people don't realize is, after this type of loss, especially the loss of your child, you do have PTSD from it.
100%.
It's been 4 years later. It can be 15 years later or 20 years later. You're always going to have that trauma from losing a child. There will be times where you have your weak moments, and they're not weak moments. I don't like saying weak moment, because you're not weak. It's just having natural emotions. And I've broken down in my car. I've broken down at work. I've broken down with Danielle
in public.
in public, yeah. So just because I'm the dad, that's another thing people don't realize, is just because you're the dad doesn't mean you're not allowed to have those emotions. The mom goes through the physical and emotional part, and we as the dads, we obligate ourselves to be that rock. We want to fix everything, and it's hard. I'm not saying it's harder than what the mom's going through. It's just different.
It's different.
It's definitely not harder than what.
And I think we'll never feel what each other feels.
No.
Like like we've talked about in the past, like, you're going through it together but alone.
Yeah, it's traumatizing, and in 4 years it hasn't gone away. I don't think it ever will go away. You find different ways of coping with it that make it easier.
And I think that the important thing to note is that this really is a post-traumatic stress. You recognize, like, war as being PTSD and, like, all of these things, but you're physically going through something, first of all, that you don't want to be going through, but it has physical effects on you sometimes. If the mom is giving birth to the baby, you can definitely have some physical trauma from that. But also your emotional, like going through all of that. There's nothing that can be put into words about how you're feeling in that moment, and then coping with it after leaving the hospital without your baby is the most unnatural thing that can happen. This needs to be talked about too. Personally, I went through a DNC, and I think nobody really talks about the procedure for a DNC, and I will never forget going through the dilation procedure. First of all, I'll never forget the feeling of my mom sitting next to me, holding my hand, and me crying, just shaking and like cold sweats, because I know what this process is about to be. The nurse telling you, like, you might feel some discomfort. And then it was so painful. I remember sitting in the car with my mom, driving from Toronto, where we got it done in the hospital, an hour drive, and I was crying the entire time. So you're feeling the physical pain for so long, and then you're also thinking that this process is something that I'm putting myself through to terminate my child. And honestly, I hate even saying it like that, like so matter of fact, but that is what happened. And that is what really weighs on me too, because I will never forget those moments. And even coming down after the dilation procedure, being in the worst pain ever, and waiting for my mom to go get the car, and I'm sitting in the lounge area, and I'm just crying and like clenching my stomach, and there's people walking around not knowing why the heck I'm sitting on a bench crying. Like, there's stuff like that people don't talk about with losing a baby, and those are the moments I will never forget. I think that you really need to advocate for yourself when you go through something like a medical termination, especially. Losing a baby in general is very traumatic, but going through a medical termination and having that guilt of the decision, I think that, like, when I went to my doctor, for example, and I said that I felt depressed and that I wasn't myself, and I was just like not doing well. And she basically said, if you ever need medication, like, let her know. And me, in my head, I've never been really one to take medication. So I was just like, I know why this is happening. It's not something that I feel I need medication for. If you need it for yourself, I know several people that have gone on medication and it's helped them tremendously. Like, do that for yourself if that's what you need. Personally, I didn't feel like I needed that, but I knew I needed to talk. I needed to talk it out. I needed to meet people. So I was looking for her to kind of like direct me to a therapist. I knew I needed therapy of some kind. So that's what I just want to get out there, is that you do feel like you're alone and you've made this terrible decision. And although you have your partner to support you, like, we only know our own situation, and we only know so much about it. So when we decided to go to group therapy and meeting people that have gone through losing a child, that helped us so much with coping. Yeah. It brought up the emotions every single time, every month that we went. Oh, yeah. It would bring up the emotions, and sometimes I'd question, like, why are we doing this? But it was helpful, and we've made lifelong connections now because of it. And I think it is really important to support each other through the decisions and the hard times and the overwhelming traumatic stress of it all. So that's super important.
I find there is a very strong community in this type of loss. You being in the hospital, there was a good metaphor there. You were sitting on the bench, clenching your stomach and crying, and nobody knows why you're crying. That's kind of what this feels like when you're out in public, because nobody really knows, but 1 in 4 pregnancies ends in a loss. There's no physical evidence of it when you're just walking down the street. This is one thing, making these videos, going to our group, talking to our family. This is something that has helped us, and just talking to each other. We're talkers. We like to bring it out in the open. So if that's not for you, then you got to find your outlet. You got to find something that really helps you cope, or helps you help mend this pain that will forever be there. And at one point it was an open wound, and now it's a scar, but that scar is always going to be there, right? So
oh my
God. That's just the way I think about it. And yeah, hopefully.
That's very true. That was a good little.
So
I like that. Sorry. Having a baby following a loss is also very triggering to parents who have lost a child in general. But when you go through a medical termination and then you have your rainbow baby, as we call it, it's a whole new world of emotion. Now having another child and seeing them grow up and knowing what their personalities like, what their likes and dislikes are, what they look like, who they look like, all of those things, the what ifs that we thought when we were pregnant the first time, all those emotions come back, and it's the guilt again. And although you're so happy to have this child in the world, and you're the most thankful person for having, a healthy child, it does leave you with more questions and more guilt a little bit sometimes, because then you're just questioning what would they be like with their sibling now. And we would have, when you see the back to school photos, and it is very triggering for lost parents, we would have a child in kindergarten already right now. So it is very triggering to talk about, and to think about what they would be like. And now seeing your other baby growing up and them being so sweet and innocent, not knowing anything about anything, and you're just constantly looking at them thinking, would they look like their older sibling?
I think for me too, well, for both of us, but the actual pregnancy, like for the first trimester and a half, the first 2 trimesters, we couldn't really fully enjoy the beauties of being pregnant and those milestones and all stuff, because we were constantly worried, like, okay, when are we getting the bad news? When are we going to find out, oh, there's something wrong? Thankfully, we never did. But it was just, there was just that dark cloud over us. And thankfully that dark cloud turned into a rainbow, and we have our little Carter. But there's always that thought, should I get pregnant again? Should I try again? What if this happens again? And selfishly, you always think, why is this happening to me? Is this going to happen to me again? Is this going to, and I didn't want Danielle to go through that again. We were already so broken. And so we know people who are hesitant about trying again, that don't want to go through that. But if you can't physically or mentally go through that at that time, don't do what's comfortable for you.
Yeah.
For us, we were on that medication. Like medically, we knew what we had to do to help with a healthy pregnancy. Obviously, there's always that wonder if maybe that wasn't it.
Even when you do every little thing right, you still, in the back of your mind, if you get pregnant again after you've had a loss, you're always going to feel that way. And it's totally normal, especially after a termination, because you have gone through that physical part of you being lost somewhat by choice. And is it really a choice? Honestly, no. For us, it wasn't. But some people do go through that choice, and it's emotionally tolling, and that's
absolutely
a whole other ball game with in the trauma world.
And for the parents out there who made choices and are watching this too, it's your choice. It's nobody else's choice. Not Tom down the street's choice. It's not Nancy next door's choice. It's your choice.
And it's your story.
It's your story.
It's what you are going through. So when we were faced with the decision to medically terminate, we were very open with our friends and family. Once the termination was complete and we felt like we were ready to talk, I wasn't just a troll hiding in my basement crying all day.
Which you're allowed to be.
It was terrible. Again, let yourself feel that. But once I felt okay with opening the door and going out into the world, that's when I felt like it was our duty to start sharing, because I naturally am a talker and I like to talk about things. We've been through a lot. We've been through me going through cancer treatments. We've been through me having a pulmonary embolism, like all of these life-changing events that I think are important to talk about. I felt like it was our duty now to spread the word about pregnancy and infant loss and get that information out there and help other people with our story. Luckily, we had an amazing support system, and all of my fears of judgment and that weird feeling of being embarrassed went away very quickly because we do have such an amazing support system in our family and our friends. But there always are some things that you don't really want to hear, or some things that are less supportive. You know, they sound supportive when you're saying it, but to a parent who has gone through a loss, it is obviously there's nothing you can say, but things like, you know, there's a lot of people that say like everything happens for a reason, or this was God's plan for you. At least you were only this far along in your pregnancy. Those are things that, again, there's nothing you can say to make anything better in that situation, but things that kind of trigger you in a way sometimes that, I mean, I've always said like everything happens for a reason. So I always believe that. But hearing that after a loss is like,
Yeah.
I don't know, it's a different feeling. Like, I don't think there's a reason why we should have lost a baby. Yes, we're talking about it and hopefully we're helping other people by telling our story. But like, I still don't think it was worth losing a baby for.
No.
So it definitely doesn't feel like everything happens for a reason. And we have been through a lot. So again, it comes down to the whole why us.
And sometimes the best thing to say for people who are listening to this and trying to educate themselves because a friend or a loved one has lost somebody, sometimes the best thing to say is nothing at all. And just literally being there just to listen to the person and acknowledge what they're saying. Because a lot of the time we just need to speak. Like, we just need to get things off our chest. So, and if you're someone who has experienced a loss and you want to let people know how they can talk to you about it, it might be awkward, but let people know how you want to be consoled or you want to be communicated to. And if you want people to say your baby's name, let them know.
Yeah.
Say my baby's name.
Yeah, because a lot of people will shy away from saying your baby's name because they don't want to bring up, you know, their name and trigger you again.
Everyone's different, so everyone wants, maybe you don't want to talk about it. I know a lot of friends that didn't even tell anybody until
we shared our experience.
Until we shared ours. And it's like, well, yeah, I've had this, and that. Some people just want to talk and not hear other people's
opinions.
Really.
Yeah.
So if you're someone that wants to help support somebody else, just be there to listen. That's honestly the best thing you can do.
No matter what their situation, whether they had a decision or not to medically terminate, be open and listen to their story. And they need the support right now. They don't need more guilt on them. So yeah, if you know someone who's been through a medical termination, especially, just remain open and non-judgmental. But when it comes down to those guilty feelings and the trauma of going through surgery and making decisions, it's a totally different thing. And it's important to connect with people who know what you're feeling. And yeah, we just wanted to express that we are available to anybody who wants to connect with us or talk about our story, share your story with us. Literally, there's nothing anyone can say to make your situation better. We all came out of this with losing a child, and that's not fair ever. And there's nothing anyone can say that will bring your baby back. So I think this is super important. And yeah, if you want to connect with us, just reach out. We're here. We're always open.
And you're not alone. So just know that. And dads out there, you're allowed to feel things too. So there's tons of dads out there that have been through what you're going through.
Yeah.
That's good. See you guys.